That's how you do it. Okay, is it on now?
I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I don't see. Oh, the seconds. Okay. And the
Yeah.
red. Okay.
Yeah, it's all right.
The alienation thing is good. In fact, it's actually for to get those 3 people going. That's actually the best theme.
I know, Dr. Brian's got the hardest job.
Hi. Yeah. It's been a while. It's good to see you. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. You can sit in this row if you want. I mean, no pressure, but.
Why not?
So it was a late arriving group, but I'm thrilled and delighted that this group got here. I think this is pretty much it. We're going to get maybe I think one other person maybe still going to get here. This is one of Aaron's doctoral exams, but of course this is the one that's distinct. It's the only one when just whoever walks in here gets to maybe be part of it. And I don't mean just by watching it either. Once we've heard Aaron, Professor Courtney Bender and I will each ask a couple of questions. You know, that part will usually pass pretty quickly, and then it'll be thrown open to all of you. So be thinking of your question as you're listening. And, oh yeah, I'm having a moment here. So this is titled, The Stories We Tell. Religious Diversity and Organizing. Please welcome Aaron Stauffer.
Thank you, Dr. Dorian, and thanks, Dr. Bender, for being here and for being my responders or readers of the exam. Thank you for everyone coming here, for those who made the trip from New Jersey, and my partner Lauren coming from Nashville. So I'm excited to be with you all this morning. All right, here we go. It is mid-July in Nashville, Tennessee, and I have just arrived a few minutes early to the monthly board meeting of Nashville Organized for Action and Hope, or NOAA. NOAA is the local Gamaliel affiliate, and Gamaliel is one of 4 national broad-based community organizing networks, or BBCO. BBCO organizing is one type of community organizing. It is institutionally based, built off of the model first pioneered by Saul Alinsky, and later adapted by his predecessors Ed Chambers and Ernie Cortez. Since last July, I have been working with NOAA as a participant observer, and much of what I say in this lecture stems from my observations, interviews, and informal conversations there. NOAA's board meetings sit at the heart of the organizational life. Issue-based task forces are sent from it to undertake research, formulate organizing strategy, and meet with public officials who are decision makers on key issues. NOAA's political power comes from the many religious and secular institutions it represents. If the organizing strategy is done well, decision makers understand that the demands from NOAA come with ramifications. Public officials recognize that if they break their promises to NOAA, and thus to their member institutions, they will pay the price come election time. The meeting is held at a large African American church in North Nashville. In 2016, a public action was held in that sanctuary where close to 1,700 people turned out. Key targets, such as city council members and mayoral candidates, were present. Throughout my time with NOAA, that public action was often referred to with pride. It positioned NOAA as a powerful organization in Nashville and is a crucial episode in the story of NOAA. When I arrived at the meeting, there are already 22 people seated in the upstairs choir room, and but by the end of the evening, the room is jam-packed. People are sitting on the floor, and I am squeezed between 2 other leaders. At exactly 6:30 p.m., an African-American older gentleman calls the room to order and introduces himself as a local pastor and as the chair of the executive committee. This is called credentialing. Whenever someone speaks, they credential themselves by naming their institution and their role in NOAA. He then calls on another pastor to pray. The prayer is marked by words like justice and doing good and hopeful. It is not tradition specific, and he ends it with, "In your holy name, amen." After the prayer, the chair asks for introductions and people go around the room credentialing themselves. At a few points, the entire group cheers or claps, such as when one man notes that he is the new president of a neighborhood association, or when someone says that this is their first meeting. It is overall a welcoming environment. Though there is broad representation of religious and secular institutions, it is by far Christian churches that are represented here. 2 individuals are from a Jewish synagogue, several Unitarian Universalists, but no Muslims. As is well known of Volinsky-style organizing, the meeting is efficiently run. When one agenda item reaches its time limit, it is cut off. Nearly halfway through, the chair asks several leaders to report back on a national training on race and power. The training was an effort by the Familial Network to confront white supremacy and white privilege in their own organizing. Several attendees stand up and give evaluations of the training. One woman notes that the training was more kumbaya rather than a real training on personal transformation, dealing with white privilege. Another middle-aged African-American woman is honest about the urgency in confronting racism in NOAA's own organizing. Standing in front of the group, she calls us to, quote, "take a look in the mirror." Her energy is slowly rising. There are a lot of, quote, well-meaning white liberals and progressives who are racist because they are so used to their ideas being the norm, she says. She tells the room that she understands why people don't want to do this sort of honest reflection because it hurts. But she reminds us that, quote, without tension, we don't move. At the height of her evaluation, she emphatically tells the room to, quote, get out and ask God. I've done it, and you may not like what he reveals, but it's worth it, end quote. She ends by recommending a program that gets churches involved in honest conversations about white privilege called Sacred Conversations. She notes that these sacred conversations aren't sacred in the sense of, oh, Father God. They are sacred in the sense of getting to know someone who doesn't look like you. We have to be honest with ourselves, she tells the room, and work from the inside out. After she finishes, someone yells, "Pass the plate," and people clap and affirm that sentiment. There is plenty about this meeting that is typical of other ethnographic accounts of broad-based community organizing. The prayer at the beginning of the meeting with its non-tradition specific and universalistic language, the exacting agenda, the credentialing of membership through institutions rather than individuals, and the emphasis on forming leaders in its membership. What is striking to me, however, is the manner and position of religion in the meeting, which seemed to leave the subterranean context and setting and rise to the fore by being explicitly vocalized and later affirmed by the group. But the expression and affirmation of religion by the group was seamless. Explicit talk seemed to point to something already present. The scene tells us something about the story of Noah and about how the group understands the position of religion in its work. To convey what is going on in this episode, I need to lay out some conceptual tools. The first is the basic claim that religious identities are narrative in structure. Explicating the narrativity of religious identities is the task of the first half of this exam. I'll start with the moral philosopher Alistair McIntyre, but we'll soon turn to sociologists Margaret Somers and Paul Lichterman. Other social and moral theorists like James Beckford, Jose Casanova, and Charles Taylor have used the language of narrativity in considering the social and phenomenological meaning of religious identity. I'll briefly turn to their work to help demonstrate the usefulness of narrativity. The second half of the lecture will turn to the broader literature on BBCO and the work of Luke Bretherton specifically. At this point, the central theme of the exam can be dealt with. That is, the role of religious diversity in broad-based community organizing. Organizing constituencies are getting more religiously diverse. So how does the diversity of religious identities influence the practice of community organizing? My answer to this question depends on the way narrativity pervades BBCO and how attention to narrativity, relational settings, and the values we hold most dear might suggest a way forward. So part one, narrativity and the socially constructed religious identities. In the early 1980s, Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue created a storm in moral philosophy. In it, he bemoans the state of our modern moral discourse. Modern moral theory is a liberal moral theory of preference, not of virtue, he argues. Our rich traditions, which have woven together time-worn arguments that prize the goods of excellence internal to the traditional practices and institutions, now lie in tatters. For McIntyre, the moral question of the human agent, what I ought to do, is a contextual question. It is primarily concerned with the goods internal to the practice. What I ought to do is not a question calling for expression of individual preference, as modern liberalism supposes. For McIntyre, moral discourse is narrative and tradition-based. Moral traditions are arguments that take place in and through time. As they evolve, they draw and redraw boundaries. One is relegated out of bounds of a tradition by disagreeing with those key argumentative claims. Traditions have their own practical rationality and theory of justice. The best of these traditions, for McIntyre that means a Thomism that equally claims Augustine and Aristotle, is based on an understanding of the human as they ought to be, and justice as it ought to be. Moral language has a direction to it, a telos. Moral traditions are like languages, and the tradition we claim, or which claims us, is our first language. McIntyre argues that learning a new moral tradition is like learning another language, which we can only completely understand if we learn its moral tradition well enough so that it is a second first language. Only when we have fully entered that second first language is commensuration between rival traditions possible. So for all of the disagreements I have with McIntyre's analysis of modern moral discourse, liberal Protestantism, and its catch-all category of modern liberalism, McIntyre was crucial in forcing scholars to reckon with the importance of narrative and tradition in their moral and ethical theory. Sociologist Margaret Somers picks up on the importance of these themes in a crucial way, and she builds off the best of McIntyre's work on narrative and tradition and leaves McIntyre's terminal wistfulness, as Jeff Stout has called it, behind. Somers picks up on the importance of narrativity early on, arguing that social theory attempts to operate outside of narrative with abstract, ahistorical concepts. Somers recognized that the explanatory value of concepts such as industrialization, capitalism, and feudalism lies in the narrativity, which they, on the face of it, disavow. For Somers, social theory needs history because social theory already tacitly depends on narrativity to carry much of its explanatory heft. Narrative as a concept came under harsh critique from the rise of the post-structuralist and postmodernist. Narrative in this account was primarily a form of representation, and it was rightly lambasted for the colonial company that it kept. For Somers, however, the concept of narrative is not primarily concerned with representation. The concept foregrounds context, temporality, and relationality. The task is not to do away with narrativity, but instead to recognize the power of narrative in social epistemology and social ontology. It is through narrative, Somers argues, quote, that we come to know, understand, and make sense of the world. And it is through narratives and narrativity that we constitute our social identities, end quote. So there are three dimensions of narrativity that are especially important here: ontological, public, and conceptual. Ontological narrativity, or what the sociologist of religion Nancy Ammerman calls autobiographical narratives, are the stories we tell about ourselves and use to explain our actions in the world. Ontological narratives are embedded in a social ontology, a way of being in the world. This means that ontological narratives are stories we craft about ourselves in society. As Somers says, quote, ontological narratives make identity and the self something that one becomes. Thus, narrative embeds identities in time and spatial relationships. What is crucial to note about ontological narratives is their processual character. They are ambiguous, moving, and tend to merge into and feed off of other narratives. Ontological narratives give us a sense of who we are in society and our position and relationship to other temporal, human, and spatial realities independent of us. Such narratives help explain our actions and even have a degree of predictability about our future actions. Quote, people act or do not act, Somers says, in part according to how they understand their place in any number of given narratives, however fragmented, contradictory, or partial. The organizers I talked to consistently refer to this sort of narrative. It is fundamental in the organizing process because it situates the leader and their faith tradition. Crafting such an ontological narrative helps leaders understand how their religious tradition is a source of power for their organizing. More than this, it helps situate the individual within that tradition itself. At this point, there are several key elements of narrativity that need to be pointed out before I go further. To start, note that Somers decenters the individual, or the agent, in her account of narrativity. She speaks of the importance of emplotment in narrativity. Emplotment is the positioning of historical events and social identities in relationship to other peoples and places and events in narrative. Events are better conceived as episodes, which come after and before other episodes. Episodes are relational. They are not standalone, isolatable objects. This is because episodes occur in relational settings, and the meaning of a relational setting is ambiguous and polysemic. The construction of a narrative occurs in settings. Narratives explain social phenomena by selecting certain relationships, episodes, and settings out as influential. This selective appropriation to a narrative is crucial because it helps explain the narrative and our own action within it. In my time with Noah, the organizers consistently referred to the importance of leaders understanding or working on their stories. They looked for points of anger, episodes where their most deeply held values had been violated. Such stories are as much given to us as they are our own creations. They are parts of larger, more public narratives about what it means to be race, sex, or gendered in this society. Ontological narratives depend on a relational web of episodes and people in space and time. Our ontological narratives support social practices and institutions. And here we come to the second dimension of narrativity. Where MacIntyre talks of rival traditions, Somers talks of public narratives. Organizers ask leaders to look for anger and selectively appropriate that episode in crafting an autobiographical and public narrative. One organizer told me that their organizing framework revolves around the central question: what does your faith or spiritual position teach you about resisting the logic and impulses of empire? We train people, he said, to answer this question in the form of a story. Such stories are ontological and public narratives. Both kinds of narratives fund the organizing process. Sociologists like Paul Lichterman and Nina Eliasov have followed Somers' lead in focusing on relational settings in narrative identities. The construction of ontological and public narratives involves selectively appropriating episodes and meaning. We act due to a large degree due to our position in webs of relationships. But we also act the way we do because we find ourselves in particular settings. The sociological study of religion, Lichterman argues, has too often taken the unitary actor model. Focusing on settings, by contrast, turns our attention to the, quote, social and spatial framework for interaction. Religious settings include, of course, the familiar examples such as houses of worship or prayer meetings. But given a moment of reflection, what defines a setting as religious becomes ambiguous. So recall the Noah board meeting that I began with. What about that setting makes it religious? Being located in a church is obvious, but for the majority of the meeting, the talk by the task forces on economic equality, on affordable housing, and on criminal justice never mentioned what we would expect to hear in a religious setting. Their talk was permeated with attention to the local economy, to the current political landscape. Until the episode where the woman asked people to get out and ask God, there was little noticeable talk of God or a sacred other. If the standard by which I identify a setting as religious is reference to a transcendent other, then there seems to be only two episodes in the setting I've recounted: the opening prayer and the explicit invoking of God by the woman. But in interviews and my time within the life of Noah, I observed something different. It was articulated to me by the chair of Noah, who said he believes this work is, quote, fulfilling God's will, or the organizer, who described Noah's work as the work of the church outside of its four walls. Two other organizers spoke of their work as a process of simultaneous theological and political formation. But take, for instance, another example. So I am back in the same church as before at another monthly board meeting. This time the group sits in the large, open sanctuary. There are about 50 of us and we don't even take up a quarter of the sonorous room. Halfway through, the group is asked to break out into task forces and join one they haven't regularly participated in. I link up with the Affordable Housing Task Force in the back of the sanctuary, well under the balcony. A middle-aged woman asked us to go around and credential ourselves. She is a longtime member of NOAA and a leader from the Jewish temple. She wants to know why we care about this issue, too. There's a lot of sharing of the similar story. Either they know someone or have themselves experienced the squeeze of arriving home cost. They are discouraged by the lack of change. They cannot imagine what it must be like to find an affordable home or apartment. One of the first to share says she believes the issue of affordable housing is a moral issue, and that phrase gets repeated more than any other. That is, until we come to one middle-aged white man who says, quote, "A lot of us have said that this is a moral issue, and I don't think it is a moral issue. It is a damn political issue, and the city government and mayor aren't going to do a thing about it." Exasperated and despondent, he sits back down, silent. "Unless what?" the organizer quickly asks. Looking a bit stirred, the older man picks up on the organizer's point. "Unless we do something about it." People laugh and smile at the organizer's quick thinking. But a pastor, whose turn it is next, picks up on this exchange. "Like my friend here, I think it is a political issue, but it is a political issue with a moral imperative. The political issue has to be driven by a moral imperative." The group quickly moves into discussing the complexity of the affordable housing issue, with what successes NOAA has had in getting the city government to delegate more money to Affordable Housing Trust Fund, what other cities in the U.S. and abroad have taken courageous, creative, and successful initiatives. And when the entire group has reconvened and each task force is asked to report back, the Jewish woman who ran the Affordable Housing Task Force points to this three-person exchange. She says with a smile, "This is a damn political issue with a moral lens." The work of NOAA, she says proudly, is fundamentally about what kind of city do we want. The act of constructing the public narrative of NOAA is continuous. If the organizer would not have responded to the exasperated comments, the entire group might have turned into a depressing fatalism. And if the pastor had not had his say, the group might act as if the political operates apart from religious and moral values. It is telling, too, that this exchange was related to the entire NOAA body. There is something about it that the Jewish leader found emblematic of the life of NOAA. Such episodes lead me to believe that what is religious about organizing stems from the way the dominant public narrative of NOAA is told, and the manner in which the ontological narratives of leaders and organizers support it. The intertwining of these secular and religious strands of the narrative seems to be so tightly wound that separating the two would result in an unraveled, nonsensical, and ultimately arbitrary separation of religion from the secular. By focusing on the way narrativity and narrative shape the socially constructed individual and group religious identities, we are able to grasp the manner in which NOAA's public narrative is a religious one, but not in a way that turns our gaze from the secular. This point leads me to a final and the most challenging aspect of narrativity for Somers, conceptual narrativity. The tendency in social theory is to remove narrativity from our concepts. Part of what I want to argue is that narrativity pervades even the concepts we use to describe NOAA's work as religious or secular. To help illustrate what I mean, I want to turn briefly to the work of three social and moral theorists who have pointed to the role of narrativity when wrestling with the question of what it means to claim a religious identity in a secular age. So Canadian moral philosopher Charles Taylor has written expansively on the phenomenological experience of living in a secular age. The relevant parts of Taylor's work regard the phenomenology of the conditions of belief in North Atlantic modernity. Through a series of subtraction theories, Taylor shows that our secular age is primarily constituted by an immanent frame, where religious belief is no longer an unproblematic standpoint in modern Western North Atlantic societies, and where our sense of the self is buffered. Meanings exist primarily in the head. Values may exist in the world, but they certainly don't press upon us in any enchanted way. Each of these subtraction theories has a narrative quality to it. Like Somers, Taylor seeks to help his readers be clear about what kinds of narratives we are telling ourselves, particularly in regard to what it means to be religious in a secular age, an age that reportedly tells us that, quote, the plausibility structures of faith have collapsed once and for all, irreversibly. Taylor works long and hard to expose the cracks in this imminent frame, so that the importance of transcendence beyond secular humanism can enter. Now, as sociologists James Beckford and Jose Casanova tell the story, there is no singular, once-and-for-all definition of secularization. Beckford's social constructivist accounts argues that terms like secular and religious are continually contested, modified, and rejected or embraced in a way that can be especially vitriolic. This point, that what is secular and what is religious are connected in an intimate way, resonates with Casanova's work. The conceptual boundaries between what is religious and what is secular are porous, and the definitional centers migratory. What is crucial about Beckford's work is the sheer diversity of themes and concepts in the literature that purports to be talking about the same thing, the same phenomenon. And Casanova would agree, there is no one narrative of secularization, but rather many different iterations. In the same sense that the process of globalization has shown us that there are multiple modernities, each following different temporalities, there are theories of secularizations. But religions, Casanova argues, are often public in a way that suggests a deprivatization of religion that does not threaten the differentiated structures of modern societies, but rather reflects back upon itself modernity's own teleological assumptions. To borrow language from Somers, public religions are examples of religions that unveil modernity's own narrativity. For decades, the secularization thesis purported to describe the past and future of religions as one of differentiation into its own respective and autonomous sphere, and then the privatization of religion itself into a subjective inner state. Casanova's research into several global examples of what he calls public religions demonstrates a deprivatization of religions, and thus calls into question basic presuppositions of some parts of the secularization thesis itself. More recently, Casanova has argued a stronger claim, saying, quote, it is unlikely that either modern authoritarian regimes or modern liberal democratic systems will prove ultimately unsuccessful in banishing religion in the private sphere. Taken in broad strokes, Beckford, Casanova, and Taylor help us to see that the conceptual narrativity in the secular and the religious is interlocking, continually woven together. Concepts like the secular and religious depend on an implicit narrativity for their conceptual cogency. What it means to be religious in a secular age has much to do with the stories we tell about ourselves and our position in a relational setting. The concept of narrativity, the conceptual narrativity of the category of religion is not one settled thing. The chair of Noah might have aptly captured the dominant public narrative by claiming that it is, quote, doing God's will. But if this is so, the public narrative is equally as concerned with damn political issues as it is with moral imperatives. To call Noah's work religious is a claim that requires attention to the narrativity at individual, group, and conceptual level, and the relational settings of such narratives. So this is the second part of my exam here, titled, Do Theological Differences Matter in Broad-Based Community Organizing? So the question of religious identity had us turn to the role of narrativity in socially constructed ontological and public narratives, but we are interested in the diversity of religious identities in BBCO. What difference do differences between religions play in organizing? For years, it seemed that the only people talking about BBCO were those already doing it, like Saul Alinsky and his protege, Nicholas von Hoffman. Nowadays, the conversation is broader, and there is an emerging field of literature that might fruitfully be broken up into three camps. And I'm going to kind of hit the highlights here of each of these camps. The first is a group of sociologists writing about organizing with an interest in bridging social capital across racial lines to further the project of democracy. Standout authors here are Mark R. Warren and Richard Wood, along with Ruth Bronstein and Stephen Hart. The second, more theologically interested group of scholars addressed the role of religious activists and the specific role of the church in organizing. Standout figures here are Melissa Snar, Luke Bretherton, Peter Heltzel, and Alexia Salvatierra, as well as Dennis Jacobson. There is more to say about Bretherton, and I will return to him shortly. The final group are those religious and philosophical and political theorists who see BBCO as examples of grassroots or radical democracy. Those are writers like Jeffrey Stout and Roman Coles, but there are also earlier writers who are like Harry C. Boyd and Mary Beth Rogers, as well as Ed Chambers and Ernie Cortez. So both Mark Warren, and Richard Wood have listed 4 broad religious public narratives that feed into the practice of BBCO. The first is Catholic social teaching, the second is Latin American liberation theology, the third is Black liberation theology, and the fourth is Protestant social gospel. If there is to be further excellent work on organizing, it needs to address the theoretical roots in at least one of these traditions. This historical tension will show that BBCO is its own theological, political, public narrative worthy of study. And out of these 3 camps, Wood and Fulton and Bretherton are the only thinkers who have significantly addressed the issue of religious diversity in organizing. Richard Wood and Brad Fulton's book, A Shared Future, carries forward Mark Warren's analysis in the 1990s on the Texas Industrial Areas Foundation. The point of their work is to illustrate how one BBCO network took the issue of white supremacy head-on in their organizing. As one PICO clergy organizer related to me, this brought on a lot of necessary and difficult conversations that challenged the dominant narrative of the work that was previously defined by white folk. Religious diversity, Wood and Fulton write, and my interviews with several organizers in the field confirm, is currently treated in a manner similar to how racial diversity was first approached. This is the colorblind model, where differences are avoided because they are thought to threaten the solidarity of the constituency. In this approach, it is better to focus on shared ethical commitments and social priorities, rather than differences that might distract from the organizing process. One complex and well-respected version of this approach is Luke Bretherton's. So Bretherton has recently claimed that interfaith relations is a central concern of his most recent book, Resurrecting Democracy. I am most interested in Bretherton's claim that organizing practices are mediating practices between each religious tradition and the civil sphere, or the body politic. The body politic is a space of convergence and communication of the state, market, religious institutions, and family. Organizing practices mediate communication between these spheres, and thus help give birth to the body politic, which can only exist if each of these spheres does not inordinately influence the others. Making a judgment on when such inordinate influence occurs stems from a fundamental tension in Bretherton's work between ecclesiology and politics. I will return to this point in just a moment, but it is important to see that Bretherton is striving to maintain a unique identity for the church on the one hand, as distinct from other secular institutions, while also arguing that religious institutions can be bearers of democratic politics on the other. Organizing practices bring about the emergence of a shared civic penultimate story of a particular place and people. The mediating work of BBCO takes place at the heart of the tension between ecclesiology and politics, and such organizing is a form of interreligious civic faithfulness. It mediates the tension, this tension and facilitates the emergence of a body politic. So community organizing for Bretherton is a practice of civic pietas. Civic pietas for Bretherton is the virtue of faithfulness to one's city, where one expresses the appropriate care, concern, and loyalty to the source of one's civic values, language, and legal systems. Civic faithfulness is not, however, a freestanding, full-blown sense of piety. It would be idolatrous and an act of sacralizing politics to claim that civic pietas might be quote, self-constituting and self-subsisting. The tension between ecclesiology and politics is at the heart of Bretherton's work, because out of it, proper Christian political judgment is rendered. His is a McIntyrean-inspired post-secularist vision. What this means is that multiple linguistic practices, religious, ecclesiological, political, secular, and so on, exist side by side. Brotherton imagines many distinct traditions converging in the civil sphere, engaging in a contest over the goods at stake as conceptualized in their own particular vision of the common good. Various descriptions of penultimate goods, goods essential to our common life together, say like education or healthcare, are articulated and constituted differently by these discourses. The conceptualization of these goods by the linguistic practices of the church, for example, is different from the linguistic practices of the state, or for that matter, by the Islamic community of faith. Organizing practices are crucial to the establishment of an appropriate balance between these discourses and their conceptualization of the goods at stake. Groups make alliances and take oppositional stances in their effort to build political power as they pursue the penultimate goods. In the civil sphere, quote, wily wisdom is needed in order to navigate this ambiguous and ever-changing environment, end quote. In the church qua church, wily wisdom is thought of theologically as Christian political judgment. It is a Christian phronesis that is crucial to his account of Christian political action. This turn towards judgment creates the theological space to consider ad hoc relationships between Christians and non-Christians. Christians have their own social logic that can even be oppositional to non-Christian political social logic. Thus, the proper relationship between Christians and non-Christians is not one of commensuration between rival traditions or public narratives, but ad hoc political action determined by ecclesiological judgment. The relationship between ecclesiology and politics is a high-intensity one. It is mutually divulging, meaning that we find ecclesiological concepts in political language already, and vice versa. So, concepts such as citizen and neighbor have both an ecclesiological and political logic. In no way, however, is ecclesiology to be reduced to politics, nor politics to ecclesiology. The distinction between ecclesiology and politics is thorough and pervasive in Brotherton's work. The church, qua church, might be in the world, but it is certainly not worldly. Only the pietas of the church qua church is self-sustaining. A common life politics is a penultimate story shared by neighbors and brought to life by the mediating practices of organizing. Throughout his work, Brotherton defines the church as an ontological category, a distinct way of being in the world characterized by God's unique presence. The difference between the church and other religious traditions is incommensurable, but this does not mean that Christians cannot participate in a common life politics with others. Much of Brotherton's work is geared towards providing Christian theological reasons for political arguments. On Brotherton's terms, how does the diversity of religious identities influence the practice of organizing? So from what I have set out, religious diversity is not a theological challenge for Christians in community organizing. To my eyes, Brotherton's conceptualization of organizing practices is not concerned with the exchange of theological reasons for organizing between different public narratives. In Brotherton's account, the public narrative of the church is self-constituted by its unique ontological and eschatological relationship with God, not a socially constructed public narrative characterized by implotment or selective appropriation. The mediation of BBCO is ad hoc, meaning involving only civic issues of shared ethical and political concern. The mediation between traditions does not involve commensuration between their respective theologically grounded, self-constituting piety. Religious difference is mediated out of the BBCO model insofar as ad hoc issues that are not of mutual shared concern are not taken up by the affiliate. Religious difference is most often embodied in the example of different clergy on a stage offering opening prayers to an action. Let me be clear, it is certainly the case that Brotherton encourages each public narrative to cultivate its own values and theological reasons for organizing, and indeed the literature of the field follows this suggestion. Take the recent example of a publication by Muslim organizers and imams that excavates the theological reasons and stories of Muhammad's life to be used to encourage Muslim participation in organizing. But what if things are more entangled? What if, as Courtney Bender asks, we need to focus on, quote, how the religious is not only lived but produced within non-religious sectors or fields? My concern goes deeper than these conceptual points, however, to questions regarding the longevity and the relational basis of organizing itself. As one clergy organizer for PICO said to me, ignoring the theological differences may avoid initial conflict, but it in no way means that the theological work is over. By focusing on narrativity and relational settings, we can ask different questions that decenter the individual, and instead focus on the public narratives and the relational settings. This does not mean that we have to leave the theological and questions of the church behind for the social scientific study of religious traditions. But it does mean that theology may need the scientific study of religion in ways that Brotherton does not consider. So how does the organizing model shift when religious values and commitments are taken out of their silos and put into play in the organizing process, in pluralistic settings that are not easily identified as religious or secular? One organizing network is asking questions like this. It is asking its Jewish clergy, for example, to construct public actions as if only rabbis were present. Several weeks ago, Megan Black, the national clergy organizer for PICO, explained to me the theory behind this shift in organizing. Organizers are very good, Megan said, at articulating the pain and anger experienced in specific issues, criminal justice, immigration, or poverty. These are important episodes in the ontological and public narratives germane to organizing, but we are not good enough. Megan said, at connecting those issues to specific values and religious commitments that keep us in the struggle in the first place. Megan put it this way, quote, you need people who have anger and you need people who have joy to get a sense of this is where we're going. So there's a place where we start, anger, and there's a place where we end, joy. And if you don't have a sense of what that joy should look like, how do you get there? We do a good job of telling these stories about anger. What we don't always do is align them to very specific theological, scriptural, and ethical commitments that aren't this kind of vague notion of beloved community. How are we holding anger and joy in concert so that we aren't telling the story without also making a theological declaration? Megan is driving at the relationship between issues and values in the work. Our concern for concrete issues stems from values that we selectively appropriate and plot in ontological and public narratives. Her call for a focus on religious values is easier said than done, however, especially if one is organizing in a religiously plural affiliate. The point for Megan is to create religiously pluralistic settings that are not assimilations to Christian liturgical styles or dominated by a Christian theological framework. Individuals of different religious traditions might then be empowered to cultivate the values that ground and motivate their concern for specific issues. What we end up with may be organizing settings that look a lot more like a mosaic of values and commitments that effectively foster solidarity in a religiously diverse constituency. Megan is arguing for a deeper entanglement between different religious values and organizing practices in a particular kind of organizing setting. This point is relevant to the dominant public narrative of Noah, which, in my experience, is strongly Christian. But what about religious values that conflict and differ in organizing? As the first section of this essay tried to argue, the values and episodes that are most meaningful to our identity are found in relational settings and implanted in ontological and public narratives. Organizers need to pay attention to how narratives understand different terms and concepts that are basic to the stories that guide this work. We tend to only hear those in our own stories, a PICO clergy organizer told me recently. The work of organizing needs to be done in a way so that leaders, quote, can understand how other leaders understand specific concepts in their own story. Organizers need to ask, quote, how is it that you have come to understand these terms as your terms only? The colorblind approach to religious diversity prevents us from understanding how specific concepts and terms, quote, fall on your ears and fall on your heart. So take Noah, for example. Nashville has a large Muslim population that is only now being engaged in a significant way. It is conceivable that the Muslim community could become a sizable and important minority within Noah. Many issues like affordable housing are acutely experienced by the Muslim community, and in combination with other issues like low wages, racial and religious discrimination. But the solution to the housing crisis for the Somali community has an additional important wrinkle: the religious prohibition of paying fixed interest. The issue of affordable housing for the Muslim community is a religious matter for their worldly life in Nashville. Organizing is about values, relationships, and the stories we use to explain ourselves and the work. When these values or relationships get threatened or violated, we react in fear, anger, even horror. This is the basis on which specific issues are selected for political action. Autobiographical and public narratives help us navigate the political and religious waters of our life together. These narratives explain where we ought to start organizing and where we are going. But these narratives also explain and accord different values of various degrees, various degrees of reverence and sacredness. Excuse me, sorry, that's my point. I believe we are at the point where organizers need to move beyond a colorblind approach and develop an ethical language to the way religious differences relate to one another. Such a language will need to grasp not only the political challenges, but also the religious challenges in our common life together. As one organizer said to me, organizing is an ongoing process of leadership formation that requires theological and political attention. Such theological attention needs to be directed to the way different narratives articulate the values that motivate organizing. So the way I see it, organizers have two challenges on two different levels when facing the challenge of religious diversity. The first has been articulated by Megan, the challenge of creating settings that are religiously pluralistic without being assimilationist to the dominant Christian theological framework. Such a focus on settings might in turn be mutually edifying to each individual tradition in cultivating its own reasons for organizing. The second challenge is developing a conceptual language that exercises greater attention to the sacred values that ground the issue work in organizing relationships. Such conceptual work will lead to a greater entanglement between theology and organizing, between religious practices and political practices. Faced with the fear of splitting group solidarity, organizers circumscribe their work to shared issues and leave untouched the sites of incongruence that might be constructively engaged. Without attention to those values that our ontological and public narratives hold dear, organizers tend to misunderstand the way religion and religious diversity influences organizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. That was excellent. It was just rich and so deeply reflects your deep engagement in this work, both theoretical and practical. I've got a slew of questions here, but I publicly committed myself to only two. So, first, a comment. Those three groups that you laid out about this litter. First, we have this the phenomenon that you quickly just pointed to, that for decades we have no literature at all except Alinsky's books, and then now we've got this explosion of literature about community organizing, which has its own sort of curiosity. I mean, how is it that people ignored it for so long, but now we've got this gusher that's revealing something about what, academics in need of a subject, or community organizers finally breaking through, or what? So there's something to that I'm gonna. Yeah. That will be my first question. But I just want to point out with reference to that, those three groups. I think you do have them right. But I just want to point out, I think I know every one of these people in category 2, and I don't know any who don't have that Warren and Wood agenda. That mobilizing social capital just to deal with white supremacy and racism. Are there any, you think, for whom the work of the church, what the church itself just so stands condemned on this issue, that community organizing ends up being maybe this is the answer to the question, after failing for so long, well, if we can at least try this, finally. Because nothing else has ever worked, and for some reason they just don't come to join us, right? We're still looking like we were before, except now there's so few of us. So there's some response of that sort clearly going on. But
Yeah.
Most of the people in this second group, I think, do get that Warren and Wood agenda is
Yeah.
what they need to be about at the church level. And of course, some of them are even radical Democrats, although I think that group also does sort out. So that's just my first, it's a real easy question, but
Yeah, no,
sort of the,
that's great.
what is going on here?
Yeah. Well, so obviously this breakdown is heuristic, right? I'm just trying to get a way to lay out the major differences between the literature and the field. And obviously there are overlaps between Bretherton's work who I placed in the second camp, and also he is deeply concerned with democracy. And
Yeah, well, Bretherton would be the exception there.
Yeah.
I mean, he is not. No, right. Bretherton doesn't get it.
okay, this is great.
Well, he's not from here, right? For one thing, he's not from any of these four traditions, right?
Right, yeah. So this
Secondly, different national context.
Right.
It's the one thing he just doesn't get here. He worked through IAF, where he's not had the struggling with this as we had in the other two big organizations. So there's just, even what he worked with and what he did just is, there's at no point did he ever get challenged to say, hey, this could never cut it at any Gamaliel organization that I know, or PICO.
Yeah. So great. So there's overlap between the camps. It was my attempt to try and just get an overlay of the field. I do think, however, that there is a sort of departure within that first camp on the focus of social capital. I think there is a turn within some of the literature that begins to sort of see the focus on social capital is actually not sort of helpful, and it ends up sort of becoming more problematic on sociological terms. That was my, and you see this primarily within the difference between Wood's work and then Stephen Hart's work, where Wood's work is full-on social capital and just picking up of bridging social capital from Mark Warren. Maybe Dr. Bender can correct me if I'm wrong here with the sociologist. So that's really what I do think, is that I think that the first one that does set them apart. They do have an emphasis on social capital that I don't think is played up as much within Snar and particularly Snar and Peter Heltzel or Alexis Salvatierra. I just think that sort of the emphasis is more on the theological concerns and particularly on the ecclesiological terms. And that drift away from religious social capital is actually, I think Braunstein's work, her last book that came out just this last summer, on a comparison between PICO and the Tea Party organizing in the Northeast, tries to, I think, sort of gets away from this focus on social capital and starts to think about the styles of organizing, about what it is, away from thinking, okay, if I can just get these relationships, then that can improve our community relations better. As opposed, there's something about the culture of democratic organizing that is important here, apart from a social capital lens.
All right. Excellent. Yeah. All right. Well, then, in that case, I think I'll get one more question. To apply this ontological narrative test maybe to the organizations themselves.
Sure.
Maybe we can leave Dart out of it because Dart just trains organizers,
right,
basically.
But
IAF's been around since the early 40s, and Gamaliel's since the early 60s, right? And PICO's founded in 1972, so we got substantial, histories here. But then also recent contentions in all those organizations about this very thing, right?
Yeah.
And how, indeed, is our people raced and sexed and gendered in our organizations and in society, and how do we talk about values and organize around interests, right? So you've been in this work long enough, and you've been in it at just a time when there's such contention in organizations, and PICO's more up right now, IF not so much, right? So there are even sort of trend lines going on. So I wanted you to just sort of speak to how your argument about all of this actually applies to the organizations, themselves.
Well, if you'll notice that all of the organizers who I then selectively use are PICO.
They're all from PICO.
They're all from PICO, and they're particularly so it's if you. I have been in meetings where, where one particular organization will continually refuse to join the table of sharing power and thinking about how it is that their organizing strategy needs to be pushed and moved. And that organization is the oldest one. You know, this is, I mean, but those who are continually, you know, addressing this shift, you know, this race and power training that Gamaliel just did, just came after 2 years of thinking about how it is that we can change our organizing model. So it's still very new. People are struggling through this. So yeah, I think it does, you know, if you're sort of say that the story that organizing is to PICO is a different story than it is to the IAF. And this is even furthermore, this is not even addressing the issue of how it is that broad-based community organizing is different from other movement organizing. What's the difference between Black Lives Matter and broad-based community organizing? PICO is probably the bridge that can help us understand a little bit. But for the majority of the other organizations, there's one specific way that you organize. You have a one-on-one, you do it for 30 minutes. After that, it's done. You know, this is not a friendly conversation. You know, you do your house meeting, it's you know, at 6:30 you start the meeting, at 7 you end it, or whatever. You know, like, there's a style and a way of going about this that has a lot that I didn't have enough time to talk about it. But the way that the story, to answer your question in the quickest way possible, the story of organizing for PICO is closest to, I think, the best story that needs to be told. And it's pushing things in the right way because it's asking these sort of questions. Other models are not allowing their models to be questioned and thus sort of calcify themselves, I think.
I love the quote from Megan Block.
I know, right? She's genius.
All right, Professor Bender.
All right, thank you. Aaron, this is a fascinating project, and the talk was very rich. And so you can see I've been revising my question.
Good.
So I actually don't know what my question is now. There are several, but I want to maybe jump off where Gary's been asking you and maybe push us in a little different direction. So as I understand it, all of the BCCOs have a certain theology that is latent or explicit, right? A sort of political theological position that it has a story. They each have their own story to tell, their own narrative, right? So at one level, when we're talking about narratives and theology, or when you are, right, you're talking about the robust traditions that they are part of, and that they are largely Christian, and although not exclusively, certainly in the way that they're being shaped, right? So at the same time, these organizations are in different ways grappling with their understanding of religious diversity to be, right? So, and I think that a lot of times, and it seems like from your field work and your being in Nashville, that this is really understood, religious difference is understood as extra Christian. Right,
yeah.
so there's something called Christian that is embedded, right, and then there's extra Christian. So that's, you know, Islam or Judaism, and which is, yet, you know, when I think about the Jewish figures, for example, who are involved in groups like this in New York, right, it's not the Orthodox, and it's not the Hasids, who are typically, we will say, I don't know, I won't say exclusively not, but they're not there, right? And so it is Reform Jewish, right? There are Muslim groups who are more already vested in a certain kind of, we might say, secular, political, theological project, right?
Absolutely,
So I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, just really honestly wondering what and how intra-Christian religious difference, which is clearly like all over Nashville, like how that is engaged by these groups. And I mean, I can't imagine that, or maybe I don't imagine well enough, but you know, I can't imagine that Christians who are not in alignment with the kinds of projects that these groups are doing are understood as religious enemies or religious opponents, right? So or maybe they are, right? So, but I'm wondering the reason I'm asking this question, I'm trying to get a sort of sense of what this political theological orientation is, and when you call, as you do on page 24, so
Mhm.
like that you believe it is time for these groups to deal with religious difference, right?
Yeah,
If it would be helpful
right.
or challenging or
Mhm.
impossible